You are listening to the Neurocareers Doing the Impossible podcast with Dr. K, episode number 24. Dear Neurocareers podcast listeners, here we are again, learning about the careers in neuroscience and neurotechnologies. And today, Dr. Michelle Miller came to share with us her career in the field of cognitive psychology. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for coming. It's a great privilege to have you on our podcast. Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and tell a little bit about where you live and the university where you are teaching, so that people who are far away in different countries would get a feel where are you talking to us from?
Well, yeah. So I'm Dr. Michelle Miller, and I work in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. So in the northern and actually quite cold, high altitude region of Arizona, and we are a primarily residential public university with a comprehensive set of programs for students, really from a whole spectrum of backgrounds and interests. So that's where I do my professional work, most of it. And I'm joining you today, though, from where I live, which is a little bit further away from Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. So those of you who ever have been to Flagstaff, you know it's famous for two things. Route 66, the famous American highway, goes right through it, but it's also the nearest major city that is near the Grand Canyon. So our absolute treasure in the United States, Grand Canyon National Park. So my husband currently works at the school district that serves the employees and leaders and all the folks who keep Grand Canyon running. And so that's his dream job. And so we live near to that today. So that's where I'm coming to you from.
That's a dream place to be at. That's amazing. So thank you for this introduction, Dr. Miller. And can you tell us, please, about this field of cognitive psychology to those who are just trying to figure out their career path and they don't know much about it? Maybe you can explain in briefly what it is, cognitive psychology, and also tell our listeners what made you interested in having a career in this field.
Oh, right. So cognitive psychology is something that it was a subfield, of course, of psychology that very much grows out of this empirical research tradition. And it is part of that research side of psychology, which complements, the side of psychology that most people in the popular culture are aware of, which is psychotherapy and clinical psychology. So, of course, we coexist quite nicely, those different sides of the field, but it is the kind of research and theory side of psychological sciences. And cognitive psychology really grew out of what happened when people started to challenge the behaviorists in psychology. So behaviors that people like B.F. Skinner and Watson and these individuals who used science to say, you know what, we really can advance our field to really focus on things that are very tangible and that are a subject for scientific study. And they, their advances are still with us today. However, there was this big blind spot they had, which is they wouldn't talk about what went on in the mind, something that had fascinated early psychologists like William James, but which were very elusive. I mean, who could say, how can I study a thought? How can I study a memory or a perception? Nobody can see what's going on. And so the behaviors had really sidestepped that. They said, whatever's going on in that black box of, quote, the mind, we don't want to know. We want to focus on what we can see as far as behavior. Well, that held up until the cognitive revolution occurred right around when digital computing started to arise. And scientists working with computers said, well, you know what? Hold my beer, because we can now say what a memory is. And this became something that, if not completely tangible and something that we could see unfolding in the human mind or brain, it was something that started to seem a lot more like something that scientists could pin down. And so that touched off a whole change in us saying things like memories and thoughts, reasoning processes, all those are systematic. And while they're not always totally predictable, they don't unfold in the same way in every single human being. There's something that we can start to develop theories about. And that's what cognitive psychologists do. So that's been around for a while. As to how I got interested in it, a pretty roundabout path. Like many of us in the field, it's not something that we started studying in high school, and therefore when we got to college we just didn't really know, okay, what would it mean to be a psychologist and what would that entail. I actually was much more interested in language and in literature. I started out as the classic English major, because also being a product of my time in education, I was told, oh, you're not, stay away from math, stay away from science. A lot of things went into that kind of a bias, and I felt like I was locked in. But I took this interest in language, and then, of course, I started signing up for a few of the classes that we tend to do in freshman, our first year in college. One of those was psychology. And I said, oh my gosh, you can actually take a scientific approach to even something like language. And I've always loved words. I've always loved books and how people express themselves. And I happened to be at a school, Pomona College, that had a very vibrant, cognitively oriented faculty who were studying things like language. And I'm going, oh, wow, I could revive this interest in science I've had all along. No one here in psychology is saying, oh, no, you can't do this. You can't. Statistics. Turned out I was pretty good at the statistics and the quantitative analysis that we do in this field. And so I switched over and I was off and running. So that was my original kind of nucleus of an interest in cognitive psychology, was in language and language processing, particularly how that ties into working memory and how we use our memories when we're comprehending language. But I really did fall in love with the rest of the field as well. The thinking processes, the reasoning processes, and today the applications of that to things that are important to everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for this exciting background. I think it makes a very important point that it is possible, and the current methodologies that we have allow to study very tangible processes. And we can study language and the thought process and memory, like you said, and attention. And the quantitative methods, they're not as hard as somebody might think. I'm very glad that you provided this example to those who might be considering a career in science, that it's not as scary as it might sound at the beginning.
Oh, yes, I agree. Thanks.
As you were developing your career in cognitive psychology, what was the biggest challenge you faced, and maybe how you were able to solve it? What helped you to solve it?
I did come up through my graduate education and all that during a time which was, I would say, just the height of what is a lot of us are questioning now, sort of academic hustle culture, that there's this there's this big competition, who can work the most hours and pump out the most publications, and that there's this tiny, narrow little definition of success, which you have to tread this little path of moving towards the big R1 university and the gigantic grants, and nothing else will really do. Anything less than that was really seen as failure. So it is kind of neat that, like I said, more people are questioning that now. If you're going to this field now, know that there are many of us who are saying there's lots of different ways to contribute to this field. And it's great to explore different paths along the way. And lots of not only one sort of job is a fit application of advanced graduate study in the field. And I used to think that I was just a bad academic. I used to think, oh my gosh, I'm not buying into this completely. I want to explore a lot of different things. I'm not only looking at a very narrow slice of academic jobs as being acceptable. And I got a lot of negative feedback, frankly, from my, my mentors and my advisors. They were trying to help. I don't really necessarily blame them, but I used to say, well, what's wrong with me? And now I'm saying, you know what, maybe people like me were onto something. So really the biggest challenge was, and where a lot of those issues came to a head, was in getting that first academic job. And for those who are pursuing a very traditional path, that's a big deal. We do change jobs in academia, but there's just not the level of career flexibility or career security sometimes that you do see in a lot of other professional fields that you could go into. And a lot of things come together. For example, I was looking at it, and at the time, there was this very strict kind of expectation that you would move anywhere in the world. It was all about the prestige of the school and the grant opportunities, and it didn't matter physically where the school was. And that is fine for a lot of people, but I was also married partway through graduate school. And while my partner has a fairly flexible job, and as we've always consciously prioritized my job, together we were just saying, well, there are certain regions and certain areas, certain kinds of towns where, we'd be more comfortable raising a family, where we'd really be more interested in going. So saying, how do I reconcile that? And seeing what kinds of schools were interested in me, which that's something that's not talked about too. Your advisors say, well, you dictate here, X, Y, and Z, but things were really, really competitive at the time. That job market was just declining every single year with fewer tenure track positions opening up. That was a big wake-up call too, to say, well, this is what my advisor envisions, but this is what I want. And here are the schools who are saying, oh, actually, yes, we're very interested in you. And here are the schools who are saying, yeah, no, pass. So really working within that was the biggest thing. I think once I did find this match at Northern Arizona University, it did turn out to be quite fortuitous, but it did mean that I needed to refocus a few things. We are a much more teaching-oriented school than what I was trained for. I was doing work in cognitive aging at the time, which is, I love that field, but I had other interests. And it turned out that our surroundings are demographically very young. So it's not like what I was doing when I was back at UCLA, and we could recruit people from older age groups to come and participate in our studies and do that, easily and abundantly. So really fitting all that together, which I never really saw as a loss or a compromise, but I suppose others could be. So I really did need to very consciously over time say, you know what, I need to separate what other people are saying is like, oh, poor Michelle, she has to work over here. Maybe she can move someday. To me saying, no, this is my dream job. I love this. And I just feel like I won the career lottery and reconciling those things and finding ways to be successful and to thrive where I was.
That's great advice to really find all the benefits of what you have at the moment from everything that the life provides you, and also not to listen too much about what other people are saying about this. Thank you so much. And you started talking about your interest first in aging populations, and then you needed to switch your research to some other populations that were more available. So can you tell a little bit about how your research developed and where are you right now? What research type are you focusing right now on?
Well, one of the evolutions that also started to happen right around the time when I was transitioning into my first and still my only academic job, I did a postdoctorate at such a lively and productive lab at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And we were focusing on developing theories relating to memory and to psycholinguistics through working with individuals who had brain injuries. And we were also able to start exploring, which was at the time a pretty new technology, which was functional magnetic resonance imaging. So using both of those. So I did have this opportunity to start also really taking in a more neuropsychological, more brain-oriented direction. So there was that. And that is something that I still today have as a thread of my research, even though I no longer work with people who I no longer engage in, directly with these kinds of studies or with functional magnetic resonance imaging. Although both of those experiences gave me just an invaluable ability, I think, to evaluate that research and to understand it in a way that can be challenging. So what you'll see today in a lot of my research interests, I do work on what people believe about the brain and about cognitive processes, particularly memory and attention, and especially people who are faculty members, people who are teachers, who, like my colleague Kristen Betts, who you've had on the show as well. Teachers are brain changers, and so it really makes sense to bring this in. And this is not something, when I started my teaching career, this was not the case. People were saying, teaching's an art, it's not a science. None of this psychology stuff is really going to bear on that. But now there's a huge interest in it. But there's also these misconceptions that float around out there. So really bringing together applied work that helps people learn more, those of us who are in teaching roles, and bring that directly to their students and looking at the impacts of that. So that's a lot of the collaborative work that is absolutely the brainchild of my dynamic colleague, Kristen Betts. So I work on that. I also have worked a lot on what I would roughly call translational science or dissemination and communication of cognitive science. So, like I said, there's this interest that's out there in what is cognitive psychology, what is neuropsychology tell us that could be useful. But like I frequently tell audiences when I'm giving talks, I say, we don't make that very easy in the field. The really hardcore researchers who I love their work, but there's so much of it and it sits in journals, and, we don't winnow through it and pick out what's going to be relevant. And then things get lost in translation quite naturally, especially when there's individuals who don't have a background in cognitive psychology or neuroscience. Sometimes they do fantastic work translating it for applications or for teachers or particular audiences, but sometimes they don't. And that's, of course, you can see how that would happen. There's a lot of technicalities and ins and outs of any academic field, and we're one as well. So I do work on that. And what do you know, that original interest I had in writing, in books, in language is now playing out in a lot of work I do, helping to edit and bring into the world books for teachers through the West Virginia University Press. I was invited to do this by James Lang, who's a tremendous figure in faculty professional development, and he started this book series. And all of these books, they do have a really powerful research basis, not always from cognitive psychology, but they do have that. And so I really feel like I'm able to bring my background, my passion for teaching and learning. And we say, these should be, he always calls it books written by human beings. So we really look at the style and is this something that's going to be engaging? So I do a lot of translational work. And I guess lastly, I work with undergraduates to also test what they know about attention and help develop their ability to manage attention and manage memory in a world that is, shall we say, somewhat distracting these days. And now we carry around devices, and instead of vilifying devices, I talk about that a lot of okay, what's true and what's false about how technology affects the mind. But with that idea of okay, let's all be more empowered to make the most of our cognitive resources in a world that is only getting more knowledge and cognitively demanding all the time, and is only getting more distracting all the time.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's the same theme that you were mentioning about finding the best and taking advantage of where you were at your place of work. The same theme you are applying here. Let's take advantage of what we have. This technology and the distractions that are going on with it. Let's do our best to take advantage of it. And I think this is something that you also reflected in your book, at least one book for sure, when you were talking about the technology and online learning. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about that? Am I correct about your book?
Yes, I have these two books out there. And this may not seem like that big a deal to other academics, but in psychology, most of our research projects are journal articles, and that's great. But this was a big new step. But since I love books, and they're a great way to really connect with faculty members, since many of us are the same thing. We, if it's a book, we will pick it up and really get a lot out of it. So I've written these two books, and they both have this technology theme. So mine's online, Teaching Effectively with Technology, came out in, oh my gosh, 2014. It seems so, I can't even believe it was so long ago. And it's still actually going pretty strong. I think I'm pretty proud about how, given that it's about technology, that it has held up over time. And that's partly because I think I really tried deliberately not to make it about, okay, here's just sort of a barrage of 20 different technologies, applications, and learning management systems, and very granular things that you could adopt right now, but really giving a framework, saying, all right, here's some processes that go on in the mind, drawn straight out of cognitive psychology. And once you know about those, that lets you get more clear on your goals, and that lets you select a technology a little bit better. So, for example, once you know that pulling things out of memory, like really actively engaging your memory, is a really great way to remember things in the future. Once you kind of have that principle and you have that really good idea about why we remember some things and forget others, that tells you, well, when I go to select a technology or use a technology that's been handed to me, which is like a learning management system, that's frequently the case in higher education, here's the features of it that I should really hone in on. So with that, I've been able to share what I'm so passionate about, which is all this cool stuff we know about what goes on in the mind, how that's really relevant to teaching and learning, and how that does let us be really selective about how we do use technology. And Minds Online, it does also have some other kind of framing material, such as, some common misconceptions about, online learning isn't real learning. This is a flash in the pan. I think too, I look back in 2014, it seems like things have come such a long way since then, not always for great reasons. Hello, pandemic and remote teaching, but it has that as well in it. And the most recent book, which I was able to publish through WVU Press, is Remembering and Forgetting in the Age of Technology. And this is just another subject that's so close to my heart. So it's really zeroing in on memory. And it has to start actually with making the case of why should teachers care about memory? Many of us are kind of taught like, oh no, that's, mere memorization should never be a part of your teaching. And I'm saying, it may not be the most important thing we do with our students, but it's one important thing. And it's really cool because this is the subject that arguably cognitive psychologists have researched the most. We've been working on this one for a long time. And boy, we have some great ideas that can say, well, how can you still have students building a base of knowledge, but not have it totally take over your course? And we also get into things like, well, is it the case that now that there's digital devices everywhere and Google exists, that maybe you don't need to remember anything, or maybe these things are having a bad effect on how we think and remember? And so I really got to discuss in some cases, very, very cutting edge research, looking at some of the positive, negative, and just neutral ways that technology affects how we think and how that plays out in higher teaching and learning.
Yes, thank you so much. And you already mentioned technology and how it facilitated development of cognitive psychology. And now we have online learning, online teaching that also changes the way we look at education and possibilities of education. Can you tell maybe a little bit more how cognitive psychology was developing over time and what were the major breakthroughs, and probably also related to some technological development, I would guess, but maybe you can tell in more details about that.
Right. So some of the biggest breakthroughs, I mean, the early cognitive psychologists, probably Atkinson and Shiffrin, Richard Atkinson, Richard Shiffrin, really started developing these very systematic concepts of memory. And these are some of the familiar ones that people, if they've taken a psychology class or two, they probably remember from the textbook. So there's a diagram of like different kinds of memory, short term and long term. But something that I always have to emphasize when I talk to people about this breakthrough is that that's not where memory research stopped. And Atkinson and Shiffrin's theory, with the little boxes and the information goes from one to the other. That theory came out roughly the year that I arrived on Earth. So, and I'm not a young person. So we are talking about a long time. We're talking about people walking on the moon. And here's this theory. But still, it started to make sense of the data that they were getting from these first systematic studies in laboratories. So, you can picture people coming in and getting these lists of very random words and having to say them back. And we do this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times to say, well, people seem to remember the first couple of words in the list and the last couple of words in the list, and everything in the middle goes away. And it does always seem to be roughly in this certain frame of how many they can do. What is going on? So that was gigantic. So even though this is not the theory that people should be locked into when they think about how we remember today, we have to give them credit for that. So what also kind of came along, especially when I was in grad school, were theories that you could call them sort of connectionist in nature or parallel distributed processing. So if you've ever flipped through a psychology textbook or an article and you've seen the little nodes with connections that go between them, that was a very different way of also looking at cognitive processes. Not so much as like, well, here's a set algorithm like what a computer would step through, but something that is very, very roughly analogous to what goes on in the brain. And so as we were evolving more knowledge of like how the tremendous interconnectivity between neurons and brain axons and dendrites in the brain, we said, well, this maybe is a little bit more in that realm. So instead of, I put in this input, computations happen, and here comes this very predictable output, saying it's kind of messy and fuzzy. That's a much better description of how thought processes unfold. And it turned out it especially is very, very good for explaining some of these psycholinguistic phenomena, such as the tip of the tongue phenomena. Believe it or not, this is incredibly revealing. We did all this research back on it back in the day. So you know how you're trying to think of the name of your second grade teacher or that guy who was in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie and he played Doctor Strange. Oh my gosh, what is his name? And you know it. I mean, if your brain were a computer, it's like it's either in there or it's not, and you have an idea of why it's glitching. And the mind is like, that's going to maybe pop up 12 minutes from now randomly after you forgot about it. So it's like, how do we explain that? And when you talk about it more in terms of these pieces of representations in the mind that sort of activate each other if they're related, you get a better idea of why we can have these very human-like, very sometimes unpredictable and messier sorts of fuzzy processes. So that was a big deal too. And I guess lastly, a big kind of tipping point that I feel has been important in the study of memory is with more people talking about not just, okay, what are these different components? Here's short-term memory over here, and it's got different subparts to it. Okay, we're nailing all that down. People shifting to say, well, why is it that way? How does that help us survive in the world? And that's another thing that I frequently really press faculty audiences to change when they're thinking about memory. I say, please don't think of it as these boxes and information just comes in because it's there and it just moves along because you, I don't know, rehearsed it or held it for a certain amount of time. We take in information and we keep it if it helps us do other things, right? So we've learned, for example, that you don't have to have something sit in short-term memory and say it over and over as a necessary precursor to learning it. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about a lot of the things that we experience or see or hear, and they stick with us sometimes forever. they're frequently not things that we sat down and rehearsed. They're things that are very important to us, that were emotionally impactful, that we understood. And so you can kind of understand and say, well, this is why the mind does it the way it does. A real case in point is this part of short-term memory or working memory called the phonological loop. It's basically, see, we have a modern example, when you get that security code of like, here's your number to type into this website where you're trying to shop, and it's a 5-digit number and it's coming in over your phone, but you have to type it in over here. What do? You say it over and over frantically, and that holds it. And that's wonderful. And we did tons of research in the field. We know exactly how this thing works. But then it dawned on somebody of like, why do we have this? Because we always assumed that you needed it for language processing. Like, oh, that helps you understand sentences. Turns out it really doesn't. There's lots of good reasons like, oh no, this does not used in natural language processing at all. And so we're like, oh no, you evolved this piece of the mind to hang on to security codes. That can't be the case. And it turns out it's useful for language learning. It's really important for vocabulary building. So that was like one of these great stories. It was like, oh, we had a mystery and we actually solved it. But that does come down to that real shift of not just, oh, here's your memory and here's how many numbers you can hold, of like, what does this thing do to help you live and survive as, a living, breathing, functioning, speaking, thinking human being?
Yes, yes. That I think is that passion of translating things is talking in you. Yes, how do we apply? How is it applicable to our life, to our survival? Why did this system evolve like this? Thank you so much for pointing that out. And with all these changes that we see that are happening in the field, and new theories and new explanations, many people do not get this new information. Like you said, it's not all really accessible to a wide range of people. And people are still hanging on to something they've heard some time ago from somebody, which information can be really, really outdated. And there are so many various misconceptions that people are still hanging on to. Maybe you can talk about 3 main misconceptions that you see around you and that you are trying to overcome with providing people a new knowledge.
Oh, yes, I'd love to. For these misconceptions, this isn't going to be original, but I'm going to reference Dan Simon, who is a towering figure in contemporary cognitive psychology, especially around attention and memory. And he actually ran a survey looking at some misconceptions about memory in kind of a typical adult population. So this wasn't even like psychology students and doing research at a university. This is real folks who are walking around in the world. So he pointed out one of the biggest misconceptions that's still out there is that memory essentially works like a video camera, that it's a recorder in the head, like a little security camera that you're walking around with. And we say, oh, big deal. So what if you think that? And memory scientists all just follow, or we're like, no, that is the last thing. Well, it's because there are some consequential assumptions you're going to make. For example, the idea that, oh, everything you experience is stored away in your head more or less accurately. And if it's all a matter of just getting to it. That's not the case either. And that can even be consequential in things like legal cases. And Dan Simons and his colleagues point that out a lot too. It leads people to think that, oh, maybe I could put you under hypnosis and get back to that security camera footage. Like, it's not in there. That memory is really more reconstructive. It's more like putting a puzzle together, sometimes with a few pieces missing, than it is like rerunning a tape. So that's one that I know still is out there. And definitely for teachers, that's not good either, because you say, well, I'm going to sit my students down, put the material on the board, and then everybody will just record it, right? Oh my gosh, not what is going to happen. As I mentioned, that assembly line idea, it's an advance over the video camera idea, because it still says we have to select and actively process only a little bit, and that, we're only going to retain a little bit. But that idea that information comes in through sensory memory, and then it sits in short-term memory, and then it moves over here, that sort of motion metaphor, it's a conveyor belt, very mechanistic. I consider that a misconception as well, not just because the theory is quite old, although it is, But here too, things like sensory memory, the idea that we hold on to just a little bit visually, auditorially for just a few seconds before we move it over. Technically, that is the case, but there too, that is a very limited actual function. And it's not something that is going to be very relevant to something like a teaching and learning situations. Like it's real neat for perception. Realistically, for why we remember some things and not others, it does not play that big a role. That too also leads teachers, I think, to say, look, as long as I just put X number of ideas in bullet points on a slide and put it in front of them, it'll just land on a conveyor belt and go someplace. They're like, no, students are processing very actively. They're constructing interpretations as that information comes in, and that's really going to determine whether it sticks or not. So that's another. I guess lastly, the other big misconception that I write about a lot is attention span. And here's where a lot of people are going to get mad at me, but this is true that if you look at folks who are doing the cutting edge research in attentional systems and how those work in the brain, it's real technical stuff, but clearly very relevant. There's this, but it's still in everyday life. And for those who are outside of that specialty area, they talk about attention like it's an egg timer in the head. So you got a, security camera and an egg timer. Neither one of these are real things. And so that talking about people's attentional capacities as, well, you have X number of minutes, right? And for a lot of reasons, that is just not the best metric for talking about attentiveness. So there is that. And there too, that, among other things, gave rise to this myth of students are attentive for 10 minutes. And some folks other than me have really traced how this myth got started and why it's not true. But I think even today you have teachers who say, well, you start the timer and students will be attentive, and then you need to do something else, and then students will be attentive. It's like, no, it's much more fluid than that, depending on what's going on and depending on what's going on in their own heads. Every individual student is going to have different levels of attentiveness. So not thinking of attention as a span, but really thinking of it more, again, as an adaptation that the mind has. We don't even know what attention actually is in cognitive psychology, but we know how it works and we know why it's there, and it's there to prioritize. And if you think of it that way, you think, well, yeah, you can divide it up, not always very efficiently, or you can direct it all in one place, but it's all about what's the top priority right now. And your attentional systems are marshaling pretty much everything else that your cognitive systems are doing. It determines what you're going to remember. So now we know that attention and memory are super linked to each other. Even things like problem solving are really changed depending on which parts of a problem you're attentive to. So seeing attention as this really important thing and not kind of trivializing it in that way, I think is really important too.
Thank you so much. That is becoming also my favorite topic now, misconceptions and myths, and my ear and my brain are tuned into this topic. Thank you very much. Now that you already told our listeners how our knowledge about memory and attention and learning is advancing, and you also mentioned that there is a shift from education or teaching being an art to teaching being a science. So those two things, I think, are very much related. The knowledge that we're getting, the new knowledge, and the shift from art to science. Can you tell a little bit more about that shift? What is happening right now in the field of education related to improving learning outcomes, and how cognitive psychology is helping with that?
Yeah, I love it. And, I want to qualify this and say, because I'm not an educational psychologist. I'm a fan. But I am in that space of, I'm a more classically trained cognitive psychologist with some neuropsychology background who's also really looking to apply it. But I could definitely tell you on the ground what has shifted. And I'd say I'm drawing here in the fact that I've worked with faculty groups, something I absolutely love doing, just getting in front of faculty groups and setting up workshops and talking about teaching and getting people talking to each other. I've been doing that for close to 15 years now. And yeah, I think when we first came in, I just think it was something that people were acculturated to, that teaching is, first of all, purely the face-to-face, usually lecture that you're doing in a class, right? And so here I think the shift is also towards more of an orientation towards active learning and that whole movement and so on. But they say, okay, here's how you want to be when you do your lecture. And I noticed to this day, when I look at like old syllabi and things for, say, one of the teaching practicum courses I have, they'll say, well, we want to teach you how to teach, so you're going to do a guest lecture. It's like, well, does it have to be a lecture? Oh my gosh. So but that of course does bring about this idea that it is a performance, that your personal charisma is kind of more important than anything else you bring to it. And of course, these things do matter, but more of a saying, let's expand the boundaries of this a little bit. It's sure a great lecture is just that. It's great. Like I pointed out in one of my books, gosh, TED Talks, we're all familiar with those. They've taken over the world. People love them. And if lecture were somehow terrible, that wouldn't be the case. But yeah, it's also about what kind of learning activities do you orchestrate for your students? What are they doing outside of class that you've figured out how to engage them, maybe through technology or something else? How do you build social relationships between the students and have that great classroom atmosphere? And how do you talk to students in office hours? How do you email them? All that is part of being a really compelling teacher. So I would say that there's this big holistic set of factors that all are kind of working together that helped push us in this direction. So yeah, 15 years ago, if I got in front of a faculty group and said, well, let me tell you I'm going to present some data and some theory on retrieval practice and how that affects retention of course material, and talk about here's some different course structures that were brought in and how those reduced opportunity gaps among less advantaged students and more advantaged students. And here's all these great data on that. I would have gotten like, what? But I teach this and you can't tell me how to do that. And here's how I do it in my classroom, and the lecture above all else. And today it's just night and day. I walk in and no matter what field somebody is from, and I had to get over my biases here too. Say people in the humanities can be just as empirically minded as the rest of us. I'll start presenting the data. People say, well, where was the sample recruited? And what's the statistical power? And what kind of statistical tests were they running? So that also there's a real development of savvy and knowledge about just how social sciences and behavioral sciences and neurosciences work. Here too, reflecting a lot of factors out there in the culture. Cognitive psychology is really popularized, by the way. When I started it, I always had to explain, no, I'm not doing cognitive behavioral therapy. That's a great thing. That's not what I do. Here's my area of psych. And people are like, wow, that's really weird. Would you study that? And now people say, oh, yeah. I read this nonfiction book and it was really neat. And I read about this study. So all of these things are working together, I think, to tip us over into that point of receptivity for evidence-based teaching. I always say you can pick and choose. I think we do develop good instincts for, hey, this is a wonderful study, very compelling, but here's why this over here, this concept is a much better fit. There's plenty of room for that, but here too. And I would say lastly, the rise of online and hybrid and flipped teaching. In order for this to gain any kind of wider acceptance, I think people really had to run the numbers. They really had to have the data. And so that too really sparked, when we say, well, does flipped learning work? I mean, what are some of the learning impacts? Then we had to talk about how that was measured. We had to evaluate the different approaches to it, interpret those data and get them out there. But that in itself also got people very used to this concept of, while we may not be able to measure every outcome perfectly, and yes, there's some things about teaching that don't fit neatly into a little outcomes box, it is something that we really do need to track in a very evidence-based way.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle. So many exciting developments and so many myths that are being busted at the moment. And my question is, how do you anticipate the future of cognitive psychology and cognitive psychology research maybe 10, 20, 50 years from now?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I may or may not be the best person to do this. I do think that we will continue to see a new or to see the continuation of what I think has been a very healthy development, which is this fluid kind of exchange and complementary relationship between more theoretical work and applied work. And I will say too, when I did come up in those that age of when I was learning to be a scholar, I think that there was also a stigma around applied work too, of like, well, sure, you could use this to help people do something or another, but we're interested in the theory. We want this, very, very abstract, removed from anything that looks a little too everyday. So that used to be stigmatized, and now definitely not. Now people are, there are lots of folks very high stature in the field who they'll do a super theoretical study on attention or memory, reasoning, and so on. And then they'll be involved in a study that looks at, how does this play out in healthcare workers? Or how could this be applied to driving safety? So I think that's a positive trend that will continue. I don't know if it'll last 50 years, but I think that we will also see a continued interest in what is admittedly one of my pet topics right now. What is the interchange between human minds, human brains, and what are increasingly technological minds and brains, and the influence of new devices and how those have kind of now they ride alike. I don't like the word infiltrate. It sounds a little bit nefarious. We do choose, after all, to use our technologies, but really more of that. Like right when I was finishing up the last book, what has really been ramping up and what I tried to incorporate is an interest in what's called cognitive offloading. So this idea that our brains are very adaptive. Our brains are super strategic. And if we don't have to keep something in our brains and we don't have to work through all the hard calculations, and we can put it off on a device or a technology, we will. And saying this is not necessarily a bad thing. There are some unanticipated consequences, and that's what we're figuring out right now. So I think that looking at that is also going to be part of it. And I do think that we are due for some more, maybe another revolution that was similar to what happened when functional MRI came on the scene. I mean, I remember when that first article came out, like I think it was in the late 80s, saying, you know what? You can actually image some of the blood flow within the brain. It's possible. And then people saying, really? Oh my God, we could set up studies that look at this. And so it's not all about the newest technology. It's oftentimes about how do we use it? How do we intelligently set up studies to use the capabilities of this? But those imaging technologies, ways of studying the brain, especially in non-invasive ways, I think that as long as it really is tightly coupled to the development of theory and good research design, then we could really see another advance there too.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I absolutely agree about these new developments, especially in human cognition, maybe attention and memory and language processing, as we start communicating with the devices directly by using our brain. So here in this podcast, we are talking about brain-computer interface technology. And in one of our episodes, we were talking about even possibilities of changes in language, because people will start communicating directly, brain-to-brain communication. So how that will work? And of course, this might have an impact on cognitive processes that are happening in our brain. So I think that might be a very exciting time when we start learning about that as well and see changes. So, but it will take some time, of course, for this to happen. Thank you so much. And talking about all these fascinating developments over time, what was the most unexpected thing you learned over your years of experience in cognitive psychology research? Maybe you have something that really struck you.
Oh gosh. The most unexpected thing. This is going to be a real tough one, because we do have these moments of surprise. I think that what I mentioned before about that vocabulary learning, that this little widget in the mind that all it does is hold on to word sounds. I mean, to learn that, like the capability of that, like some of us, we can hold a few things in that, and some of us can hold a little bit more. That capacity does things like predict your vocabulary development as a child. It predicts how easily you're going to pick up foreign languages. That was a big one. I think another really unexpected thing that development that really I treasure, because again, I was there for it when we discovered it, when Morton Gernsbacher and her colleagues used this brand new functional MRI technology to find something in psycholinguistics that made sense theoretically, but made sense to nobody else at the time. Looked on the face of it like the strangest experiment. They gave people a series of sentences. A woman was looking out the window. A woman was worried about the future. A man walked across the field. A child played in the yard. You can give people those sentences, or you can say the woman looked out the window. The woman was worried about the future. Just changing that article, A versus the. I remember Morton and Gernsbacher talking about this. She said, you know what, when we put people in an fMRI and see, we want to see if there's a different pattern for these. And people said, that's this minuscule little word. And it lasts less than a second. You're not going to be able to pick up any differences. The brain is not going to do anything different. And they said, let's try it. And there's a vastly different activation pattern in the brain. Why? Because people are engaged in what was just a theoretical construct at the time, mapping. So they're creating this whole discourse and a whole more connected structure. When that article changes, it triggers this whole other process. And furthermore, where does a lot of that happen? On the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, anybody who's had a little bit of psychology or a little bit of neuropsychology, we know, of course, the left hemisphere, especially around we call the parasylvian cortex and some parts of the frontal lobe. Those are the rock star when it's the rock star when it comes to decoding language and putting together sentences and deciding what you're going to say. But that's not all that goes on in language. You also have to put together the ideas, especially if you're not just in a psychology experiment listening to isolated words on, presented on index cards. If you're actually talking and listening, and that's where the right hemisphere comes in. So we had to scratch everything. I tell my students, yeah, you're going to read these little diagrams in your book that say, oh, language is right over here in this spot. But if I had to color in the areas that are involved in language and memory, I'd color in the whole thing. So that's how we really, really learn. So those are two of the things that I thought were really surprising and amazing. And I guess lastly, I know that retrieval practice, that process of pulling things effortfully out of memory, that was kind of a surprise too. When we said, oh my gosh, when we give people this little memory test, that actually changes the memory itself. It's not just testing it. So that was also a wonderful shock and surprise, and one that we are still getting a lot out of when it comes to actually helping students remember.
Thank you so much, Michelle. If somebody wants to follow your footsteps as a cognitive psychologist, what would be your recommendation? Where to start? What to do? What to read? So anything that you can recommend.
Oh boy. So, being the book nerd that I am, of course, I think starting there is good, but it's important to start with something that's quality, because really with anything in psychology, if you do just go out there and Google, you're going to find a lot of misinformation, as we've been talking about. And so you want to really have something that's pretty curated in terms of quality. But fortunately, there are these great books out there that are, first of all, great books, period. They're a wonderful read, but they're also based on solid information. So I can maybe even, share with your listeners a show note or something later on. I put together a blog post a while back that lists some of my very favorites, but I can say, just to map onto some of the things we've been talking about today, if you can ever pick up Christopher Chabris and Dan Simon's book, The Invisible Gorilla, it is wonderful. It talks about attention and also those intersections between things like attention, intuition, judgment, and so on. Brilliant book and a great introduction to some of the science of attention. Dan Schachter's classic now, 7 Sins of Memory, that talks about, again, why is memory not a video camera? What does happen that makes our memory sometimes so poor? And what are all the ways that it can fail? I would say Make It Stick. This is another book. It was a collaboration between memory researchers and a journalist who put together a good book about improving memory in everyday life. And of course, Dan Kahneman's now, of course, modern classic Thinking Fast and Slow, which goes well beyond some of the research that you read about, again, in a Psychology 101 textbook, and really puts it together into a framework. So there you have it. You've got the framework I always love to use, which is what about attention? What about memory? What about thought processes? So those are some that fit in there. So starting with your own reading, I think most psychology classes that you'll take today, even if they're introductory, they're going to have a pretty good treatment of cognitive psychology as well. And for those readers who want to dive more specifically into the scholarly literature and look at some of the newer research that's coming out, some of the great journals in this field are, well, there's one that's just called Cognitive Psychology. It's wonderful. Applied Cognitive Psychology, as you might ask. I've published in that one recently. Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition. It's a mouthful, but it's kind of like the top journal that publishes the best research right now on that comes out at any given time in cognitive psychology.
Thank you so much. And we will add all the information that you can provide into our podcast notes for our listeners. And the last question, impossible today, common tomorrow. How to make what seems impossible today possible?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think that we do live in an era of absolute revolution and opportunity when it comes to higher learning. I think we really, really do. And that's something that I don't think really gets its due. I think that's a pretty big deal that I can say, in the space of a decade, the attitude toward the things like active learning, evidence-based teaching, looking at inclusive teaching, which is also incredibly important today, universal design for learning, all of these things, the fact that the awareness of this has so radically changed among faculty members. And I do want to say, too, it's not just younger faculty members, because I think that's kind of an ageist theme that shows up sometimes. There are faculty members from all across, not just the disciplines, but also the demographic spectrum who say, I am interested in this. I know a lot about it already, and I'm actually putting it into practice. So that's a big, big deal. And the fact that we have learned so much about how human beings learn, and we are now designing technologies. I mean, we don't always have this perfect collaboration between educational technology developers, the industry and the science and the teachers, but I think it's getting better over time. And so now we have more things to pick from as well, where we can say, here's something that I want to accomplish pedagogically, and I can actually adopt something in my class, whether it's online or face-to-face, and it actually makes that happen. That's incredible. The fact that, we saw MOOCs, massive open online courses, that's something that had a bit of a boom and a bust. But one thing that we did retain from it is the fact that an individual who, as long as they have access to some basic computing technology or even a mobile phone and a cell signal or internet and electricity, if you have that, in a sense, you have access to lectures, instructional materials, many of them free and open, and many of them from some of the top universities in the world. That was not a thing at the beginning of my lifetime. And it now really, really is. And so that is something where we can say, I think implicitly we've considered it impossible that people around the world, no matter who they are, where they are, that they could achieve post-secondary educational goals, that people can and will keep dipping in and out of knowledge development, and they will all learn how to do that for themselves, learning how to learn. That is a real possibility, and that is something that, as we say, can and will change the world. Educated people, we may not be perfect, but we have a much better ability to work together, to solve problems, to, everything from our planetary climate crisis to conflict, reduction all around the world, to reduction of things like intergroup bias, sexism, heterosexism, these things that have really been a scourge of humanity for as long as I think we have gone back as a species. We can make progress in that, and we can make progress in it through learning and through understanding ourselves. So that's what things like this podcast helps us to do.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I remembered about one question that you and I talked before we started recording the
Yes.
podcast. Yes, now there is this time of finals for many students, and they're trying to cram all the information. They're getting stressed about studying for their final exams. Maybe you can provide some advice from the standpoint of cognitive learning, some advice on how to prepare for their finals better.
Yes, and I can say there probably are some students out there who are going, "Oh, that's wonderful! That's such lovely, high-flown, verbiage about education." But I have 4 finals next week and a life to live in the meantime. Yeah, so you really have to go for efficiency, students. This doesn't mean cutting corners. It means remembering, first of all, your mind and your brain will only take in what kind of clicks as being immediately apparent and relevant and that you are actively engaged in. If you are in the highlighter fest of I'm turning pages and spending hours and it's not sticking, you may as well frankly, go take a nap or go to bed for the night, because that's not time that's well used. Remembering that you do have to be attentive and engaged. I got a lovely tip from my brilliant colleague, Rebecca Campbell, who also works in this area. The other day, she said a very simple low-tech thing you can do, she teaches students, is get a certain color of Post-it notes and, stick them in your book at different pages. When you see that Post-it note, that's your cue to say, am I actually taking this? Do I need to go back? And if I need to go back and review, let me do that. And if it's still not working, I need to close the book and do something else. So having that ongoing awareness of your own level of engagement is really, really important. You cannot go for, just raw hours and hope that that's going to help, especially not at this time. So, of course, retrieval practice. So this can look a lot of different ways. So closing the book, quizzing yourself, looking away from the website that you're on and quizzing yourself. A great technique that many folks have advised is teaching somebody else. And there's a wonderful, wonderful researcher in this area, Sandra McGuire, who's written several books on this. And I've heard her talk about things like, look, if you've got a teddy bear, if you've got a goldfish, you explain these principles of organic chemistry or British history, you tell it to them. And that does force us to process things deeply. It keeps us attentive. It makes us relevant. And it also reveals what we don't know, which is another big pitfall for students, is they, sort of passively read, and that makes you feel like, yeah, I think I've got it. But do you really? You don't know until you actually try to retrieve it. And that's a fun and very effective way to do it. I think using small bites of time. So especially if we're talking about, just the basic facts that you need to know, or vocabulary terms, take advantage of the fact spacing and distributed practice helps put those into memory. So make sure that you've got your materials, or even better, a flashcard deck, a Quizlet deck, something that when you're stuck in line at the dining hall, or you're waiting for the bus, instead of maybe, pulling out social media or doom scrolling the news, use that time, because those little bites of time, even if it's a few minutes, that hugely pays off. And once you've got the foundational stuff, then you can spend your more concentrated study time making meaning, to say, okay, can I compare and contrast this? Can I give an opinion about it? Why does this matter? How does it maybe relate in this course? How does that relate to another course? All those connections in your mind make material really stick and make it more available to you at the time you really need it, which is during that final exam or other kind of capstone experience that you're going to have. So that's what I would say for students who are in that. And take good care of yourself. Do remember that sleep is super important. So be very planful about how you're going to get all that together and not come out of it a wreck.
Thank you so much. Excellent advice. And it reminded me of myself when I was in the elementary to middle school. I had all my different teddy bears and different dolls sitting, like probably 10 or 12 of them. And they were all reciting what I needed to prepare for school. For example, if I needed to learn a poem, we were given a lot of poem to learn. Each of them was reciting a poem. So, of course, I was reciting for them. And I was grading. I was starting, grade started with the lower grades, and then we're going up and up and up. So basically, I was teaching through them and learning through them. I think that's a beautiful approach. And I also was then later doing some explanations of physics and mathematics and so on and so forth. So I was using intuitively this approach of teach another person, and I was learning myself this way. So I can say that it really worked very, very well for me. So, no, thank you so much, Michelle. That was absolutely amazing, amazing conversation. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it very much. I wish you all possible success in everything you do. And I hope to see you maybe in some time to see what developments happened in your life and in the life of cognitive psychology as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I love your insights and enthusiasm too. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about these ideas.